All right, I think we can start now. So first off, can everyone hear me and see my screen? If you can, just type in the chat. Okay. Okay, so welcome to lesson 8 of Introduction to Web Development. So today we're going to be covering JavaScript loops, conditionals, and functions. Yeah, and as always, this lesson is recorded and posted on the YouTube, so you can always go back to it. I've also shared the slides on the Google Classroom, so you can follow along on those slides. So first, a recap of what we learned last time. So we learned that JavaScript is a programming language which we use in web development to give websites interactivity and to make them less static, and also to allow the user, the visitor of the website, to interact with the website. We also learned the difference between JavaScript and Java. Although the syntax is similar and the name is similar, they're completely different things. So we're learning JavaScript. Also, why JavaScript? Because to make websites less static. And also some basic JavaScript variables and operators. So how to declare variables, how to add stuff, multiply, modulus, whatever. So that's what we did last time. Another thing we did last time is the basic outputs. So document.write writes something directly into the HTML web page. Window.alert creates an alert window, the pop-up window, and then console.log outputs into the console, which only programmers can see using when you're programming, or if you view the console from the web browser. So today, like I said, we're going to be working on loops, conditionals, and functions, and those are 3 different things. So before we start all of that, first we have to know what a conditional statement is. So in all programming languages, we have conditional statements. So this is like the backbone of most programming, right? So conditional statements are statements that are used to, they basically say that if a certain condition is met, then the block of code will run. So if something happens, if a condition is met, then this will happen. If not, then something else will happen. So that is what a conditional statement is. So in JavaScript, we use what are known as Boolean operators to test if the specific condition is met. So for example, we can test if the variable x is less than 5, or the variable x is equal to 10, or whatever. So we can use conditional statements to test for these things. And conditional statements follow an if-then construct. So if this condition is met, then this thing will happen. Or it could be more complex, or you could have if this happens, then, or if this doesn't happen, then if this other condition is met, then this will happen. Or if both of these conditions aren't met, then this last thing will happen, so else. So I have this diagram here, this flow diagram. So the code, it's running through the code until it reaches this conditional statement. And this represents the condition here. So like anything that can be tested. So if x is less than 5, and if the condition is true, then the conditional code, so the code that runs if the condition is true, will be run. And then after it runs that code, it'll proceed to whatever is afterwards. And if the condition is false, then it'll just skip this conditional code and move on to whatever is afterwards. So how do we compare these? What happens with the condition? How do we test if the condition is met? Well, we use Boolean operators. So Boolean operators are basically these like keyboard characters that we type into the code to tell the computer to compare these condition to another stated condition and output if it's true or false. So on the right side here, we have some pretty obvious conditions. We have the greater than or the less than signs. So that just tests if the left side, whatever's on the left side, is greater than the whatever's on the right side. And same thing for less than. And then how do you test if it's greater than or equal to? You just add an equal sign after the greater than or less than sign. And then along with that, we have these operators here. So we have the 2 ampersand sign. So that means that if you're testing 2 conditions and both of them must be true for the whole thing to be true, then you can use the AND operator. So it means that condition 1 and condition 2 must be met in order for this whole thing to be equal to true. So both of them have to be equal to true. And this is the 2 line thingies. This is the OR operator. So condition 1 or condition 2 must be true for this whole thing to be equal to true. And both of them can be true, or one of them can be true and one can be false, and it'll still equal to true. And then we have an exclamation mark. So the exclamation mark means not. So it means the opposite of whatever Boolean is expressed. So if x is less than 5, if that statement is true, then if we have a exclamation mark in front of it, then that means it's false. Because the not true is false. The opposite, that's the opposite. Same thing if x is less than 5 is not true. If that's false, then if we have a not statement in front of it, then it'll become true because it's the opposite. And then the 2 equal signs is testing if it's equal to. So if x is equal to 5, then this whole statement is true. If x is not equal to 5, then it's not true. And then the exclamation mark equal sign is not equal to. And if you're confused by this, you'll see how it works in if statements and loops in a few slides. So basically, we use these operators. We type them into our code to compare 2 values or more and see if that variable that we want to test meets the conditions that we've stated. And then each statement, so basically it'll tell the computer if this statement meets the conditions, and then the Boolean value will be true. So then the whole thing will be true. Or if it doesn't meet the conditions, then the output will be false. And so the prime example where we use these Boolean operators are in if statements. So in JavaScript and in most other programming languages, we have if statements. So if statements basically say, okay, so if this condition is true, then we'll run the block of code inside of it. So in this example, we have a variable called age, and it's assigned to the age of 15, right? So it's the number 15. So in our if statement here, first we have an if keyword and then parentheses, and then we test if age is less than 12. We're using the Boolean operator less than here. So we're saying if 15 is less than 12, which it's not, but if it was, then this block of code will run. So if we open up REPL.it here, go to our JavaScript file here to demonstrate, I'll demonstrate this example. So if we have a variable called age, let's say it represents someone's age in numbers, right? Let's say their age is 9, right? we can test how if this age is too young or too old. So we can write in a basic if statement, if age is less than 12, like in our example, then we can run the code. So the if statement starts always with the if keyword, and then inside the parentheses, directly following it, you have to have a comparison. So in this case, we're comparing the number 9 to the number 12, and we're saying if 9 is less than 12, which it is, then this will run. So if this whole thing outputs to true, then this block of code will run. This inside part block of code will run. And in this case, we're just going to make an alert window, or alert pop-up too young, right? And then if we run it, we'll get a pop-up that says too young because 9 is less than 12. So we're using this Boolean operator here to compare two numbers, 9 and 12. Now, what if you wanted to test out multiple cases, right? What if you wanted to say, okay, if you're less than 12, you're too young. If you're between 12 and the age of 60 inclusive, then you're just right. And if you're older than 60, then you're too old, right? What you could do is you can write 3 if statements to test it out, right? So we have our first if statement that tests if this age is less than 12. And then we can have our second if statement, which tests if it's greater than or equal to 12, and if it's less than or equal to 60. So that tests whether or not the age is between 12 and 60. And we use the ampersand here because we want both of these conditions to be true. We want to test out a segment of this whole range of numbers, right? We want to see if it matches between 12 and 60, so we use 2 ampersands. And then in this case, we'll just do something simple like window.alert just right. And so if our number, the thing we're testing here falls between that range 12 and 60, let's say 15, then it'll pop up just right because the statement executes false on this if statement, so it doesn't execute this line. So then it goes to whatever's after that if statement, and then it tests this one. In this case, 15 is between 12 and 60. Therefore, it'll execute this. And then we can have like a third if statement, right? If age is greater than 60. So all numbers greater than 60 will run this block of code. Then we'll just do window.alert too old. And so if our number is like greater than 60, like 70, then it'll alert us too old, right? You could do that. So what happens there is it'll go to this first if statement, test if the condition is true. And if it's not true, then it'll skip this stuff and go to the second if statement, test if this is true. And if it is true, obviously it'll run this. And then it'll go test the third one out and then do that. So actually, that's a little bit inefficient because if we're testing the same thing and we can only know that, and we know that this number can only fall in one of these categories, then why should we, if we know that if it, for example, if it falls less than 12, as a number less than 12, then why should we test the rest of these when we know that it's already this section, right? If the age is 10 and we know that the age is less than 12 based on our test, then why should we test out these conditional statements? Because we know that this one works, therefore these other two statements won't work. So if we have 2 more if statements here, it'll be inefficient because even though it matches one of these statements, the other 2 will still be tested. And we obviously know that it's false. Therefore, we're just wasting processing power because we're testing these 2 if statements even though we don't need to. So what you can do is you can have else ifs and else. So we have our first if statement here, and then we can, if we want to test a second condition for the same variable, then we can use else if. And basically what that does is it says that if this first condition runs, and if it's true, then we'll just skip the rest of it, and then it'll just skip to the end, and it won't test the other ones. But if it's not true, then it'll test this one. Now the end one, the third conditional statement here, instead of doing another if, since we're only testing 3 conditions, we can just do else. So that means that since we're testing the same thing, if this statement does not run, and if this statement does not run either because they're both not true, then whatever number, then it doesn't match any of these conditions, therefore we must run this one. So in this case, if we're above 60, then it'll run this one. Notice that the else statement does not have a conditional in it because that's the last thing that you put. So if it does not match any of the previous conditions, then this will happen, right? Then this is like the backup plan, kind of. But if it does match any of the previous conditions, then it'll run that block of code and then it'll just stop there. It won't test out the rest of these conditions. So that's how you write if statements, and else if and else. You could, if you have more conditions you want to test out, for example, instead of between the ages of 12 and 60, let's say you only want to between the ages of 12 and 20, and then you wanted to test out another group, like for example, age 20 to 60, then you can just write another else if to test out if age is greater than 20 and age is less than 60, then you can just write okay, match, I don't know. Then you can have, so however many conditionals you want to test, you can just add more else ifs and just leave the last conditional as an else. So that's how we use if statements. And remember, if statements use if then construct. So if age is less than 12, then we'll print that out. If not, then we'll go to the next block of code and test if age is this condition. And if it's not, then we'll go on to the next one, and then we'll go on to the next one if that's not the case. Okay. Hold on, let me send this code to someone. Okay. Actually, I'll just send this into the public chat, so if anybody needs it, you can just copy and paste it. So that's if statements. Now, oh, I actually have an exercise here. Write a JavaScript code that will take in 2 numbers and display the larger number in the console. This is a pretty easy exercise. You should only need 2 minutes for it, so you can just write that right now. All right, so I guess I'll just explain this if you didn't get it. This is a pretty easy one. So let's say we have two variables that represent two numbers, right? var num1. And I'll just make that some random number like 5. And we can have another variable, var num2, which represents the second number, right? And I'll make that 10. Now, obviously, you know that 5 is less than 10, but how do you make it so that the computer tests it for you instead of you just writing everything out? We can use an if statement, right? If num1 is less than num2, then console.log num1, right? And then, but what if that's not true? We have to print out the other number then. Then we can just do else console.log num2. So if this is not true, then it'll print out the second number, because if this is not true, then the second number must be the bigger one. Oh wait, no, I'm printing out the, I'm supposed to print out the larger number. So this should be num2 then, and this should be num1. And then obviously prints out 10 because in the first statement it runs and it's true, therefore we print out the second number. But what if it was switched? What if this was 5, oops, or 5, and this number was 10? Then this statement does not run, but this one does, because this is the backup plan, right? If this statement is not true, then we'll just revert to executing this block of code, and then it'll be 10, obviously. So that's just a very simple exercise for if statements. Next, we have loops. So loops are these things in our code which we write, which allow us to run the same code over and over again until a stopping condition is met. So basically, a loop is just a special conditional statement, which until the conditional statement is no longer true, it'll keep on running until the conditional statement is false, and then it'll stop. So if we look at this flowchart here, right, we have the start, we start running it, it comes to this conditional statement. For example, x is less than 5. Now, if the conditional statement is true, it'll run the code enclosed by the loop. And then it'll run it, and then it'll go back and it'll test the condition again. If the condition is still true, it'll run it, the statement again, and then go back. And then if it's still true, it'll just keep on running, until the condition is false, until whatever number over there is false. If it's false, then it'll just skip the statement, the loop's code, and then it'll just go to the end. So you have to have something inside of the loop code that edits the condition, the number, so that it'll eventually go to false here, eventually. So the first type of loop that we're going to cover is a while loop. So a while loop basically just executes something until it's not true, right? It'll keep on executing whatever is inside the block of code until the conditional statement inside of the thing inside of the parentheses is not true. So if it's true, it'll run. If it's not, it won't. And if it's true, it'll keep on running until it's not true. So like the same block statement here. If the condition is true, it'll execute and then go back and test if it's true again, and then go and loop until until the condition is not true anymore, and then it'll just go to the end of the code. So it's like an if statement that keeps on running until it's not true. So an if statement runs only one time, versus a while loop will keep on running until it's not true. For example, let's just do something really simple here. We'll make a var x equals 0. And then I want to print out all the numbers between 0 and 5, inclusive. So we can write a while loop, right? While x is less than or equal to 5. So while x is less than or equal to 5. So when this is true, it'll run. We'll just console.log x, right? Now, before you run the code, so this line prints it out, right? But there's one important thing you have to do, which is you have to edit x in some way so that eventually it'll be greater than 5, because you don't want it to run infinitely. So you have to make something so that it'll eventually become false, this conditional statement. So in this case, since we want to print out everything from 0 to 5, we'll just use the increment operator, x++, so that every time, every iteration of this loop, every time we run the loop, it'll add 1 to the variable x. And eventually, since we're always adding, eventually x will become greater than 5, and this loop will stop. So to represent when the loop stops, I'll just console.log end. So in this case, it prints out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It starts at 0, right? Because the initial value was 0. And since 0 is less than or equal to 5, we'll run the code inside. So we'll print out whatever x is, so in that case 0, and then we'll increment, so we add 1. So now x equals 1. And then since 1 is less than 5, then we'll do it again. And then we'll keep on doing it until the last iteration, when x equals 5. We'll print it out, and then we'll add 1 to 5. So x equals 6 this time. Now we go back to test the condition. Oh no, 6 is not less than or equal to 5. Therefore, we skip to the end, and the loop terminates, and we do whatever's afterwards, after the loop. And again, x++ or x minus or x++ or plus x, that adds 1 to x. So this is an increment operator from last class. We basically just plus 1 to whatever x is. Yeah, so that's a basic while loop, how it works. And then we also have for loops. So a for loop is a little bit more complex. Basically, you have the for keyword, and then you have the conditionals inside of the parentheses, and then you have the block of code afterwards. Make sure you have these curly brackets always, and then whatever loop statements you want in here. So inside the conditional, when we write a conditional like this, for a for loop, we must follow this structure. So notice there's 3 parts of the inside here. The first part, which ends with a semicolon, we declare a variable. So we declare a variable. So we're making a variable called I in this loop, and I will be equal to 0 for the start. So, and then we end off with a semicolon. Then the second part of the loop of the conditional statement is the actual conditional statement. So this is where we say, whenever x is I is less than 5, then the loop will run another iteration. And then the third part of the inside parentheses, we have I++ or plus I. It doesn't really matter. And this is what modifies the counter so that eventually this loop will stop. So this just increment operator again. So this basically does the same thing as the while loop before. If we go in here, we type out, instead of having all this, we type out for x equals 0, x is less than 5, and then we do plus x, or you can also do x++, and then we enclose in brackets. Then it should do the, oops, we don't want this here. It should do print out everything from 0 until x is greater than or equal to 5. Notice when it prints out into the console here, it starts at 0 but ends at 4. Why doesn't it print out 5? because in our conditional statement here, we said only x is less than 5. We didn't say less than or equal to. So since when x equals 5, this statement won't run, therefore it won't print out 5. So how do you print out 5? You can just do x less than or equal to 5, and then it should print out a 5 at the end. But this is 6 numbers that it prints out since we start at 0. Okay, so let's read some questions here. What is the difference between I++ and ++I? That's a great question. So we have the increment operator here, right? And I'm just gonna get rid of this for a second just to demonstrate this. The difference between plus or ++I and I++, right? So this is a classical question, which is prefix versus postfix. So prefix is when we put the increment operator in front of the variable, and postfix is when we put it afterwards. So let me just make an example here, right? We have a var I equals 1, right? And if we do ++I without anything, oh, we need the semicolon, and we console.log I afterwards, it should print out 2, right? Because in this statement, we're making var I equals 1, and in this statement, we're making var I equal I plus 1, right? Because we're incrementing. And if you do the same thing for postfix, meaning you add 2 pluses afterwards, it does the same thing. So there's really no difference if you do that. But the difference comes in, and it's a subtle difference, when you're doing stuff with the variable I. For example, let's say you want variable A to equal to I plus 1. You want it, right? You could do I plus plus. And if you see what happens, oh wait, I forgot to print it out. If you see what happens, A still equals 1, even though we said, well, even though we said A is equal to I plus plus. Doesn't I plus plus mean that we're adding 1 to I, therefore I is equal to 2, and therefore A should equal 2, right? But see, that's the difference. If you do plus plus, it'll add 1 to I after the assignment operator. So basically here in this line, var A equals 1, which is what I previously was. But after it, var I actually equals 2. So that's what happens when you put plus plus after. What if you said you wanted A to equal 2, which is 1 plus I, right? Then if you could do plus plus I, so that's prefix. So we put the increment operator in front of the I. And what that will do is that'll add 1 to I first, and then assign to A. And then it'll be 2, because it'll add 1 to I first. So now I is 2, and then it'll assign to the variable A. So that's just a little thing. And it works for minus minus too. So when you're doing a decrement operator, same thing. Now, in a for loop, when you have a third conditional statement, this part here, doing plus plus I or I plus plus doesn't matter, actually. In this case, it doesn't matter. I prefer usually putting plus plus in front of the variable because it's just a tiny little bit more efficient, but that's just what I'm used to. So in a for loop, it doesn't matter. But when you're assigning stuff or printing stuff out or doing stuff with the variable, then you should be aware of this. Yeah, so that's a for loop. Now, Another a common question that's asked is, what's the difference between a for loop and a while loop, right? You can do the same thing. In this while loop, we're printing out everything from 1 to 10. In this for loop, we're just printing out everything from 1 to 0 to 5. It's the same. You can do the same thing, right? You can, let's say I want to print out everything from 0 to 5. We can do var x equals 0. X is less than or equal to 5. And then we just console.log x, and then increment x. Oops. And then it will print out from 0 to 5. We can do the same thing with the for loop. If we have for var x equals 0, x is less than or equal to 5, plus x, get rid of this, it'll do the same thing. So what's the difference between for loop and a while loop if you can just do the same thing for both? Well, to be honest, there really isn't that much difference. You can, for both of them, you can probably use them for the same things. But generally speaking, we use a while loop when we do know that the condition will equal to false at some time, but we don't know when it'll equal to false. So we don't know when the while loop will stop, but we do know that it'll stop at some point. So that's when we use while loop. We generally use a for loop when we know how many times we want it to iterate. So we know that we want it to run 10 times or 15 times or whatever. So we use a for loop when we know how many times we want the loop to run, versus a while loop, generally speaking, we just make it, we do it so that it'll run until at some point it'll stop. So that's the difference between a for loop and a while loop. So we have exercise 2 here. Write a program which will iterate from 0 through 20 inclusive and print out into the console if each number is even or odd. So if you want to write this right now, it should take another 2 minutes. You can start doing the exercise. And a hint, you have to use a for loop and if statements inside of the for loop. Oh, and print out like that number is even or is odd or whatever. All right, so that one was also slightly more complex, but still pretty easy exercise. So when we look at this problem, the first thing we have to do when we're coding this is we have to iterate from 0 through 20 inclusive. So to do this, you could do like a while loop, but we're just going to use a for loop because we know that we just want it to run from 0 to 20. So inside the for loop, we first iterate through from 0 to 20. So var I'll just use I equals 0, I is less than or equal to 20, and then plus plus I. So this for loop will, every time it iterates, it'll iterate from 0 to 20 inclusive. Next, we want to test out if each number between 0 and 20 inclusive is even or odd. Now, how do we do that? Well, it's very simple. We can have an if statement, and then we have an else statement. So the if statement, we can just make a test if it's even, right? So if I, and how do you test if it's even or odd? You can use the modulus operator. Remember, the modulus operator finds out what the remainder of something is. So I divided by whatever, and the modulus operator gives us the remainder of that. So in this case, since all even numbers are divisible by 2, then the remainder of an even number dividing by 2 should be 0, because there's no remainder when you divide an even number by 2, right? So then you can just print out console.log I plus is even. And then since we've tested if the number I is even here, we can just write an else statement, because if it's not even, it has to be odd. So we can just do console.log I plus is odd. And if you run it, it'll tell you, it'll print out all the numbers from 0 to 20 if they're even or odd, like that. Oh, and the plus sign here can be used to add two numbers together. It can also be used to add a string with a string, or a string with a number. So in that case, we just print out everything like that. Yeah. Exercise 3. Write a program to find the sum of the multiples of 3 and 5 of all numbers under 1,000. So you can, I'll give you another 2 minutes for that. It's a very similar exercise to exercise number 2. Oh, okay. If you want the answer to exercise number 2, I'll just paste it into the chat. Okay. So let's see how to do this if you don't know how to do it. So first, of course, we have to iterate from 0 to 1,000. The problem should have said under 1,000, between 0 and 1,000. So we're going to have a for loop, right? Create a variable I equals 0. I is less than 1,000. You can also make it less than or equal to 1,000 if you want it to be inclusive. And then increment it. So that iterates between 0 and 1,000 and finds all the numbers between that. And also, since we're trying to find the sum of the multiples of 3 and 5, so we want to find a sum, we have to have a variable that stores the progressive sum of the numbers. So we'll create a variable called sum equals 0. And then inside the for loop, to test if the number is a multiple of 3 and 5, we can just use the modulus operator again to test if that number is divisible by 3 or 5. So we can just use an if statement, if I modulus 3 equals 0, or if I modulus 5 equals 0, then we'll add it to the sum plus equals I. So these two, that's or, right? So if it's divisible by 3 or if it's divisible by 5, then we'll add it to the sum. And we use the plus equals here because you could do sum equals sum plus I, or you could just do sum plus equals I. That does the same thing. And then eventually we can just print it out. And then that should give us the number, which is obviously pretty large here in the console. Oh, another exercise. Okay. Exercise 4. So write a JavaScript program to construct the following pattern using a nested for loop. So we want to print out an asterisk and then 2 and then 3 and then 4 and then 5 using for loops. So what is a nested for loop? You probably have never heard of it before if you haven't programmed before. So a nested for loop is a for loop inside of another for loop. So yeah, you can take 3 minutes to try to figure that out, and then I'll paste this code into the chat. Yeah, okay. So think about how you can have one for loop inside of the other in order to print out this statement. Okay, I think it's been around 3 minutes. So let's do this. So first we're trying to print out an asterisk and then 2 and then 3 and then 4 and then 5, right? So the first thing is notice how many rows there are. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have to create an outside for loop that iterates 5 times to create 5 rows, right? So we'll create a var I equals 1 since we're starting with 1 asterisk, and then I is less than 6, 6, since we want up to 5 asterisks, 5 rows, and then we can do plus plus I. So that's when we iterate through each row. Now, how do you make it so that each row there's progressively more, progressively one more asterisk printed out, right? Well, we can create a nested for loop inside. So another for loop inside var, we'll create a var y, and this time we're going to make var y equal I, and then y is less than 6 plus y. Oh wait, no, oops, I made it opposite. For y equals 1 and then y is less than I. So that'll tell us how many asterisks are in each row. Then we need that. Then how do we print it out, right? So first, on the outside of both loops, we have to create a storage variable, so a string variable, string equals, and we'll make it empty for now. If you don't have anything in between the 2 quotes, that just means it's empty. And then so inside the inside for loop, we can do str plus equals an asterisk. And then on the outside, inside of the outside for loop, but outside of the inside for loop, we'll do console.log str, and that'll print it out. And then afterwards, we'll do str equals, and we'll empty out again. And then if you run it, you'll notice that 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, this should be equal to. Yeah, and then now it'll print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and like that. So let me explain this a little bit clearer. So the outside for loop, that tells us how many first how many rows there are, and also how many asterisks this row should have. So in the first row we should have 1, in the second we should have 2, in the third row we should have 3 asterisks, fourth 4, and then fifth row we should have 5. So this tells us how many. How do we make it so that each row has that many, right? The inside for loop will add 1 asterisk for every iteration it goes through. And this inside for loop, so y equals 1 initially, and then it'll iterate however many times that the I like the size of I is. So however, since I represents how many asterisks is that there should be in that row, then the y iterates however many times that is, and then adds an asterisk to the string, storage string. And then outside of that, afterwards, we'll print it out, that string, and then we'll empty the string and make it empty again. And then it'll go back and iterate again in the outside for loop and the inside until the outside for loop ends. Yeah, so that's how you use a nested for loop. And I'll copy and paste this code into the chat if you need it. Oh, and also just a word of caution. When you're making loops, you don't want to do something where you create an infinite loop. So an infinite loop is when the loop keeps on running and it never stops because the conditional is always true and it'll never stop. So for example, if we have a while loop where we have var x equals 0, right? And we have a while loop where the conditional states while x is less than 10, which x currently is, and we say console.log x, and we forget to increment x, that means that x will always stay as 0, and it'll always be less than 10. Therefore, it'll keep on running forever, and if you run it, it'll crash the web page, and now you can't do anything. And now I have to close the web page and reload it. So don't make an infinite loop. Make sure you always increment or decrement your code so that it will end at some point, or else it'll just keep on going. Oh, and also the break statement, break keyword, if you have like while x is less than 10, and we have x equals var x equals 0, the break statement is a statement that you can use to break out of a loop. So we can have x plus plus, and then if x equals 5, we'll break. So the break statement is just a keyword that you can use to break out of the loop. And in this case, since we have an if statement there, it'll say that when x equals 5, we'll stop this loop. So if you don't know, if you're writing something and you don't know how to get out of the loop, you can just type a break statement and then make sure it's attached to like a conditional, like if statement, so that it'll break sometime. We're almost out of time here, but there's this last thing we have to cover, which is functions. So a function is like a, it's a block of code that does something, like everything we've been typing just now, but it's reusable. So we can call it, and let's say you want to call it several times, but not in a row. So you want to use this block of code several times in your code, then you can create a function so you can type less. You only need to type the code one time, and then you can just type a call sign to call the function whenever you need it, and we can reuse the code that way. So basically, and I'll teach this through an example. Let's say I want to create a really stupid function, but a function that takes in two numbers and returns the sum of it. So we can create function. We first start off with a function keyword, and then we have the function name, which it can be anything. I'll just say sum of. And then we have parentheses, and then these curly brackets. So inside the parentheses, you put variables, the number of variables that you want to use inside of it. So it's called a parameter. It's what you input into it. So in this case, we'll just make a variable called a and b. So these are, a and b are local variables. They only work inside of a function. And since we're doing the sum of, we want to return the sum of these two variables. So if we have to have a return statement. So return statement, whatever is after the return keyword is returned. So a plus b in that case. Yeah, so how do you call it? How do you input numbers? How do you whatever? Well, how do you call a function is you use a call statement. So let's say we have var a equals 5, var b equals 6. And we want to use the sum of function, right? You can call the sum of function. Let's say we want to assign var c to the sum of var a and b. And obviously we can just do a plus b, but for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use this function that I created. So var c equals, you have to use the function caller. So you do the name of the function, and then inside the parentheses that you put after it, you have to have two things that you want to insert into the function that will be used. So in this case, we'll do 5 and 6. Oops, or no, a and b. Actually, these should be two different named variables because that's confusing. So when you call the function and the parameters that you input have to match the number of parameters that are written inside the function declaration. So in this case, we say that this function can take in two variables of any type. And when the variables are inputted into the function, then whatever number is inputted first, we'll label it E, and whatever number is put afterwards, we'll label it F. So now these two numbers are labeled E and F inside of this function. And then we just do whatever we want with E and F. It doesn't actually change these two variables outside here, but you can change this stuff inside here, and then we can return the sum of that. So then what the return value is, whatever the return value of is from this function, it'll get assigned to this var c, and then we can yeah, and then var c obviously equals 10 plus 5, so we can do console.log and print it out just to demonstrate. And it equals 11. So that's just a short demonstration of making functions. Yeah. Exercise 5, I think we're out of time here, so I'll just do this right here. Write a function that takes in a number as a parameter and prints out that many asterisks using a while loop in that function. So this is pretty easy, right? Let's say we'll just say var a, which is the number of asterisks we want. We can make this any number we want. I'll just make it 11. Then we make our function, right? Function asterisks. And then we can just have the input there. And then we can use a while loop, right? So first of all, we have var, we create a counter variable. So this will count how many iterations equals 0. And then we can create a while loop while counter is less than or b. Then we'll print out an asterisk, right? Console.log asterisk. And then, as always, plus we have to increment counter so that it's not an infinite loop. And then if you run it, oh my God. I forgot to call the function, so make sure you call the function too. We'll just, now this function doesn't have a return statement, but we're just gonna call it without assigning it to anything. And then it'll print out 11 asterisks like that. So in this case, we only have one parameter and we have no return statement, but we can still call it and it will still run. So that's the last exercise. And that's all for today. If you have any questions, you can ask it in the chat. And then the homework will be posted soon after the class. Yeah. Also, I'll also post the document with all the answer keys to these exercises in the classroom. Oh, can I paste the code for the last exercise? Yeah, sure, I forgot that. Yeah, the class is over right now. You can go if you want, or if you have any questions, you can stay. Oh, and as always, if you have any questions outside of class, please email me. yeah. Um, Sophie, what was your question? Or what do you need help with? Okay, I just unmuted you.
For some reason, when I do console.log, this quote, the sum of plus string parentheses a and plus and in quotes plus string b plus is in quotes plus string c in parentheses, it doesn't work. So it would be way easier if the host allowed me to share my screen.
Okay.
Or you can just share it with, I already shared it with you on ripple.it, so like you can just go into it.
Okay.
You click ripple.it, and then at the very top, there's like these 3 lines. Ripple.it, yeah.
Oops.
And then you can see stuff. I don't know how you access it.
What's your website name?
My website name is all about me. The only letters that are a capital is the first letter and the last 2 letters. And my username I will put in the chat.
Oh, I think I got it. Okay, so I think your website has like some private information on it. Like, I think,
I shared with it.
yeah, let me stop sharing my screen and then I can like help you individually.
Okay. So see your screen for now.
Okay. So why do you have, if you're trying to print out the var A and var B and var C, you don't need to do string and then parentheses. You can just put A there. You don't need to put the string and stuff in front of it. Even though they're numbers, when you use the addition sign with other strings, it'll automatically turn the whole thing into a string. So, and same thing for string C, yeah.
And okay, I have one up here. So like that.
It should print out. Although I don't see it on.
See, it doesn't print.
Oh, C is not defined.
What? Where's C not defined?
Yeah, you didn't create a variable C.
Okay, so why now?
No. Keep it A and B, but since the sum variable that you created at the bottom,
So
you just want to plus sum because that's yeah. But one thing though, you have multiple sum variables, so generally speaking, you want to have it a different name.
okay, so I'm just going to change this to C.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it should work.
How does it know which one I mean?
Which one?
Like kind of some I mean.
Like what do you mean? Which one it means?
Like before, remember I had two sums. How does the computer know which sum I'm talking about?
That's a good question. So, um, I'm I'm not exactly sure for JavaScript. I think in JavaScript, since it's for web development, usually whichever sum comes later, the last one, that's the one that it prints out. Um, but generally speaking, you don't want to do that because that's a little bit confusing. And in a lot of other programming languages, like for example, like Java, they'll give you an error for that. So yeah, just make sure that each variable name is different.
Okay. So thanks.
Thank you. Um, Anyone else have any questions? Okay, so it seems like there's no more questions. So if there's no more questions, I guess we can end the class. Please email me if you have any more questions. Yeah.